From the studios of the Optimism Institute, welcome to the Blue Sky Podcast. I'm your host, Bill Burke, and in every Blue Sky episode, we'll be speaking to leaders, researchers, and thinkers whose stories and insights will remind us that there is always blue sky above. Sometimes you just have to get your head above the clouds to see it. In past episodes of the Blue Sky Podcast, we've discussed how political division and dysfunction in this country are major drivers of the pessimistic outlook so many of us have developed. My guest today is someone hoping to do something about it, and in a novel way. Lindsey Cormack is a college professor, and she's found in her students a remarkable level of ignorance about how our government works. She teaches smart kids. They know a lot about many other things, but the teaching of civics and government has been missing from their elementary and high school educations. Lindsey decided to do something about it, and last year, she published a terrific book targeting parents called How to Raise a Citizen and Why It's Up to You to Do It. Lindsey Cormack is an associate professor of political science and director of the Diplomacy Lab at Stevens Institute of Technology in Hoboken, New Jersey. How to Raise a Citizen is her second book. Her first, entitled Congress and U.S. Veterans, From the GI Bill to the VA Crisis, investigates differences between legislative efforts and lip service paid to veterans by members of the U.S. Congress. She earned her PhD in government from New York University and is raising a daughter on the Upper East Side of Manhattan. She currently serves as the Secretary for Community Board 8 in New York City. Her research has been published in popular outlets including the New York Times, the Washington Post, 538, ProPublica, Roll Call, the New York Post, NBC News, The Hill, and many more. She also created and maintains the digital database of all official Congress to constituent e-newsletters in the DC Inbox Project. I hope you enjoy this Blue Sky conversation with Lindsey Cormack as much as I did. Lindsey Cormack, welcome to the Blue Sky Podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to talk with you.
It's great to have you on. I'd like to start, I'm talking about your book and about your interest in civics, and your book is called How to Raise a Citizen and Why It's Up to You to Do It. But before we get too deep into the book itself and what you believe, why do you think this issue is so important that you'd sit down and write a full book about it?
Sure. So I'm a college professor. I've been a college professor for 10 years, and I'm at a school where I have some of the best students. They have really good test scores. They know how to do school, and they go on to great careers. But something that I find as the person tasked with teaching them Introduction to American Political Science or American politics, they don't know a lot. And it's not their fault, We don't teach them a lot in K through 12. And then by the time I get them in college, they're bewildered. And that doesn't feel that fair. And so I wrote this book because I have great students. I don't want them to go through the world wandering and playing catch up. But I know that if we don't start to change things at earlier ages, we're not going to fix this.
Right. So behind all this is just a concern generally about how politics are going. And you have said, and you said in your book, politics is going to happen to us whether we like it or not. So we might as well understand how the system works. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, and that's something that, one of my students this week said a very similar thing to me. I said, "Why are you taking this class?" And she was like, "Well, I figure this is going to happen to me whether I like it or not." And I was like, "Oh, that's
Really?
right. I say that all the time." Yeah. Politics is inevitable, and it doesn't have to be that bad, but none of us gets out of this life without having some sort of interaction with government. Every day we have interactions with government and public service. And so it's something where if you can know a little bit more, it doesn't have to feel that bad. And actually, you can really value it and maybe almost honor it and say oh, it's really good that we have this system that works in such a wonderful way.
And the subtitle to your book and Why It's Up to You to Do It is a call primarily to parents. So can you explain why, some would say, oh, the schools should teach this. Some would say, I don't know where else you might learn after school programs. You say it's a great opportunity for parents. Why do you take that position?
Yeah. So when I started to write this book, I had six research assistants, and we went and looked at how civics is taught throughout the United States. And originally, we thought we might be writing a handbook that was like, here's the schools that do it right, or here's the states that really have these policies laid down. And what we found in the course of that research is no one's succeeding. And so it became a call to parents because it's actually really hard to get this done in schools. And I'll just give you a short few reasons why. One is curricular time is really stretched. And if it's not tested, it's usually not taught. That's something that we
Right.
heard from teachers throughout the US. And if you
Yep.
think about what we think of as an indicator for what a good student is, it's an ACT score or an SAT score. And neither one of
Right.
those exams has any components of civics, social studies, anything like that. But secondarily, it's really kind of hard to get this done in the way that we have structured how we deliver this in our classrooms. It's different in every state. It's a really hard question to answer, like how does it get taught? But here's the modal form of delivery. In most states, in seventh or eighth grade, kids are going to get their first social studies or US history class. They're going to learn about founding fathers, some westward expansion. And then we wait again until your second semester of your senior year of high school. And there's usually a government class then. And I
Yeah.
don't know what you were like your second semester, your senior year of high school, but it's not a really receptive time for new
Checked out.
information.
Yep.
Yeah, your
Yep.
head is somewhere else. It's like, what's next? And so when we look about how we do that versus everything else, where we K through 12, we stair step, we learn a little bit more each year. We don't really approach civics like that. If you're just looking at the numbers of it, it has the lowest in class time out of any subject. It has the
Wow.
five lowest scores on our AP tests. And it's also something where if you just look at dollars, for every $50 that the federal government spends on STEM, we spend 5 cents on civics. So there's
Is
no
that
one
right?
who can reasonably look at this and say, like, oh, yeah, we're doing it right. This is how to do it. And the last thing I'll say on why it's hard to get it done in schools is teachers are a little bit afraid of it. We interviewed
Yes.
teachers after the pandemic, and they had a lot of oversight in their classrooms because parents could hear it on Zoom. And so they don't want blowback. They don't want someone to hear something the wrong way, even if they're well meaning. And so they're just like the incentives make it really hard to do it in schools. And it can be a rich form of conversation for children to have with their parents. And so we just need to kind of think about our culture approaching it differently.
Let's talk about that blowback because I think it raises an important point that you observe in the book, which is when people hear civics or government, they often think politics or red state, blue state, conservative, liberal. And so I'm assuming part of the blowback is a teacher feels like they step into this and a parent's going to think, oh, you're too woke. Oh, you're too conservative. And you're saying this isn't really about politics per se. It's more about how does our government work? How can you get involved? Is that a fair way to describe both the reasons for the blowback and also how you think of this?
Yeah, I think that's a terribly fair way to think about it because in a lot of teachers' minds, they know that they're meant to lay the groundwork. But let's say they did something really easy that was just like, here's the three branches of government. Congress is the
Right.
first branch because it's Article 1 in the Constitution. A child might hear that, go home, tell a parent, and a parent might say something like, do they not like the president?
Yeah,
And then that
exactly.
sort of like telephone misunderstanding,
Right.
they might have, like a Facebook group that gets mad. They might email a principal. They might email the teacher directly. And so no one really wants that.
Right. Right. And you've said too, though, one of the challenges of doing this at home is a similar concern, similar but different, where maybe a parent doesn't want to pass along their own views or make the child feel, talked down to or told what to do. Or frankly, there's a piece in one of the papers today just about how a lot of parents are struggling. A liberal parent, all of a sudden their kid's wearing a MAGA hat or the opposite. And so again, you're saying that sometimes parents shield themselves from these difficult conversations. Your point is that that's life and you should really be able to take these on at home.
Yeah, that is life. And then, I am reading some of the similar stuff where it's like, I can't believe the son that I raised in my house now has this view that is opposite of me.
Right.
And when we think about it, I like to use an analogy, which is if you were trying to raise an athlete versus a spectator. If you're trying to raise an athlete, you teach them the rules of the game, you run some practice drills, you make sure they're
Yeah.
conditioning. If you're trying to raise a spectator, you teach them like the chants, the colors they're going to paint their face, the people who they're going to cheer the loudest for. But in politics, we're really all athletes. Some of us are just better at it than others. So even if you sit out and think, oh, I'm on the sidelines, I'm a spectator, that's not really true. You're just dragging
Interesting.
whatever team you might have been on down. And so people should want to raise athletes who understand the system. If they pick a different party, so what? The parties change, the personalities change, our lived experiences are different. And if you were to raise a child that has an opposite partisan identity from you, that's not a marker of failure. In some ways, it's a marker of success. It's a marker of a house of love that understands different opinions. And the best social science research on this right now indicates that you can't really make your kid a little Democrat if you want to, or a little Republican if you want to. It's about a coin toss if you can do that sort of parental transmission. On the other side of it, you might risk alienating them altogether or having them prefer the other party. So we need to think about raising political athletes, not political spectators who have really strong party allegiances.
That's great. And not only might they just find their own way, they're going to get taught by somebody probably. And do you want it to be TikTok or someone who's screaming loudly on a cable channel, or do you want to have a reasonable conversation as parents with your child?
Yeah, I think that's right. It's the same thing with like sex or drugs.
Yeah.
They're going to learn it somewhere. You might as well do it. The thing is, a lot of parents have far more experience with sex and drugs than they do politics. And so they maybe feel more ready for those conversations.
Right.
But we're letting this important piece get offloaded into, you're right, whatever's on TikTok, whatever algorithmic content's getting delivered to our children, instead of developing a muscle memory with them to say, like, here's how reasonable people can disagree. Here's why it's important to care about these things. And so much of what we actually ought to care about is local and state politics, but we really get in a frenzy about national politics, but most of us don't really have an ability to influence once the electoral die is cast. And that's just simply not true for many quality of life things that happen at the state and local level.
Listening to Lindsey talk about why adults shy away from discussing government and politics reminds me of how concerned we've all become about the potential of being misunderstood, misconstrued, or worse, canceled. She lays out a very sensible way for parents to talk about these subjects with their kids without feeling like they're steering them in a particular direction or dismissing the views that their children hold. And I like the analogy of athletes versus spectators. Democracy truly should be a participatory sport. Of course, one of the things that keeps us from feeling like we can participate is the sense that getting involved is out of our reach. But in our next segment, Lindsey Cormack will explain how local government is an accessible way to get involved and also a place where actions truly impact our daily lives. One of the things I liked about your book was this emphasis on local and state governments. So not only back to the athlete spectator, and your point is in civics and politics, we're all athletes because we're all should be voting, participating. You're also saying we can run for these offices. We can or attend town hall meetings or run for school board. And I thought that was really helpful. And by the way, that's one of the paths towards federal office if you're so interested. But your point is that, and I agree completely, we get so spun around the axle and angry and upset about what's going on in Washington, D.C. But what really impacts us as people and families is more local.
Absolutely. So, local officials are doing things about zoning. They're doing things about what sorts of businesses can come into your communities. And if we think about some of the big policy spaces right now, like reproductive health care or guns or drug access, that's state politics now. That's not federal.
Right.
And it's something where the sort of narratives many of us have in our head are about federal politicians, and we sort of import that to people who are doing state and local work. And that's simply unfair. Most of the people who do state and local politics are essentially volunteers. It's not a glorious job. They think they have something to offer. They're trying their best. And something that I get as a question is people are like, would you ever run for something? And I'm like, maybe if I didn't like the people who are doing the work where I live, but I'm very dialed into that. And I really agree with most of what they're doing. And even when I disagree, I think they're reasonable people. And so, if you find yourself really frustrated by your local politics, it's not that hard to sort of get in and start to change the game.
Exactly. And that whole part about, I think, and I blame a lot of things on social media, probably unfairly, but I think social media has created this environment where it's really easy to have sort of the hot take or get involved in an argument, from the safety of your basement online. And I think understanding how government works could help us break some of that, because I've told the story before, but my wife, when we lived in a smaller town in Maine, she was on the school board, and you get paid nothing. You're hopefully making a difference. And oh, by the way, you're on an email list where you get some of the nastiest, most scathing, if you want to upset people, back to local, mess with their kids in the school and that sort of thing. And, you're at the supermarket and someone just shares their opinion. These are tough jobs. And so I'm not saying this is a way to dissuade people from doing it, but to help people understand, again, like you said, they're not doing it for fame. They're not doing it for money. They're trying to do the right thing. So could we all be more civil in our communication with folks like that? And then also help make these things more appetizing to people to serve. I think one of the things that keeps people,
Absolutely.
when people ask you if you want to run, I've been asked about, do you want to run for office? It's like the process, the criticism, the incoming, it's a scary thing. And if we could sort of demystify that and also turn the temperature down a little bit, we'd be doing a great service.
It is. And I imagine you like your job as I like my job. But I also imagine that if the local politics in your area got so dire, where you were like, oh my God, I can't recognize this dystopia, who could fix it? And no one else was raising their hand. If we had a democratic system like we do today, I imagine reasonable people were like, okay, it's time for me to do this.
No, I think that's right. And as people say, in a democracy, you get the government you deserve. And if we're all going to be passive and not be involved, then that's a big problem.
Absolutely. And I think something else that sort of has destroyed generations of us is this idea that everyone who's in politics is out for themselves. They're liars, they're egomaniacs, they're cheats, the system is rigged. Because if that's the set of facts that you think you're coming into, who wants to be there? Like, who wants to hang out with
Yeah.
liars and cheats and people in rigged systems? But for most of the like local and state stuff, it's really like they are underfunded, undersupported, trying their best, holding it together. And I kind of think about it like anyone who's ever had insight to a PTA, because PTAs,
Yes.
that's like a volunteer, but everything goes a little bit better. There's social glue, there's activities for kids, and it fills in all these things. Government's sort of like nationwide PTAs, and someone has to do it.
Yeah.
And we'd rather have people want to do that instead of think everyone else who's doing it is in it for bad reasons.
So when we say civics, I think people can get confused about what it means. How can you define civics for us and sort of when you say how to raise a citizen, what kind of things you'd want to cover?
Yeah, so civics is actually a word that I don't love because I think when
Yeah.
people hear civics, it sounds like anodyne and boring, and it could mean
Yeah.
volunteering, it could mean like
Yeah.
walking older people across the street. And so I think
Right.
civics sort of like washes people in a weird way. In the book, I mostly opt for politics and government, politics
Yep.
being the like act of getting into the power of running the government. But when I
Yep.
talk about citizen, I do not mean this. And I have like a part in chapter one where I'm like, look, on this terminology, it doesn't mean you have this paper, you don't. You're legally entitled to this sort of program, you're not. It's someone who has agency within a society that they live in to change it for the better, for the worse, but an understanding of what their role can be. And so at the end of the day, we are all sort of raising citizens. I mean,
Yes.
most of them here are going to be US citizens, but everyone is a citizen of a smaller community. And as long as they have the agency to understand what are the levers of power here, what's the landscape that I'm operating in, that's what we want to make. We want to make our children understand the environment they're walking into instead of thinking that if we just don't talk about it, it's going to protect them in some way.
Right. And I think some of the silver lining, and we talked before we recorded about what it's like to be you teaching in a college environment when politics have become so front and center, so divisive, so frankly tumultuous. I mean, no matter what you think about who is or has been in office, it's been a tumultuous time. The silver lining, I think, is it is exposed a lot of these issues where it's like, oh, that's why the Supreme Court's important. Oh, that's how the Electoral College works. Oh, wait, the president can't do that. Oh, the president can do that. Is that a fair way to describe it? And when you think about parents sitting down with kids, is that part of what you'd want to cover? Like literally, here are the branches of government. Here's how it works. Is that what you have in mind?
So, yeah, I think your characterization of the past few years is correct. And I'll say, as someone inside the classroom, different administrations elicit different responses from students. But overall, the sort of tone that I've had for the last 10 years is like inquisitiveness, not like,
Yeah.
oh, I don't care about this. It's more like what's happening here. And that's because, children are just trying to make sense of their world and figure it out. And I get them at the very end of that sort of cycle. So I see them that way. But in terms of what parents need to talk about with their kids, I don't think that our kids need us to be government trivia experts. They don't need you to be
Right.
able to like
Right.
win the nights of like, oh, and what year was this thing adopted and who ratified whatever. What I
Exactly.
want us to do is when they're younger, I want us to normalize having political conversations instead of thinking they're taboo. So I grew up in Kansas, and something that's more characteristic in the Midwest and the South is this notion that like some topics are off limits. That might be
Yes.
like a discussion about religion or the sort of job and how much money someone makes, or sort of like their sexual preferences. And politics gets put in that bucket. And so
Yes.
my request to parents is not so much like, here's all the pieces your kids need to know. It's if you allow that conversation to exist, your kids are going to ask questions. You're going to learn something. They're going to learn something. And then they can see there's a value in having that discussion. Because for many children, in the book, we go over a nationally representative survey where only 25% of kids admitted having like political conversation that was intentional with their parents, which means most of our
25%.
kids get out
Wow.
of high school having not talked to their parents about this. And a lot of it is parents today were raised in a system that was already actively deprioritizing this sort of education. We're also very afraid of saying the wrong thing and having people be
Right.
mad at us. And online cultures incentivize stuff that's like meaner and tends to be viral based on the ability to insult or like incite something. And so we don't really have good models. So it's sort of just a plea of like, hey, can we get started doing this in a little
Yeah.
bit of a better way? We all recognize there's an issue and no one else is coming to fix it. But we're the adults in the room now, so maybe we could take it on a little bit.
I'm not sure when it was that our collective attentions turned more toward national government and away from local, but I do think this has happened, and it's not always helpful. Local government is where so many decisions are made that directly impact our daily lives, and yet we tend to pay them less attention. And unfortunately, oftentimes when people do pay attention, they subject local government officials, who are usually unpaid volunteers, to a level of anger and vitriol that's unfair and dissuades others from ever getting involved in the first place. So I do hope we'll all consider Lindsey's suggestion, not only to get personally involved in local government, but if that's not right, for us to engage with well-intentioned officials with a degree of civility that we all deserve. Now, back to my blue sky conversation with Lindsey Cormack. People might wonder, what does this have to do with optimism and pessimism? And my view is that, first of all, one of the reasons I think optimism and maintaining a sense of optimism is important because it's pessimism that leads to apathy and disengagement, in my view. And why I think what you're writing about and teaching is so important, and I'd like to hear your reaction to this, is that hopefully if people can understand how politics works and how government works, they can abandon that idea of, well, what's the point? I have nothing to do about this. I can't, my vote doesn't matter, or I live in a state that's going to go this red or blue no matter what, so why would I get involved? Versus if you understand this, say, okay, no, this is how I get involved. This is why it makes a difference. This is why I might want to run for school board. Is that a fair way to describe it? Because my hope would be that people leave your class or people read your book and say, oh, okay, this is how I can actually make my own small difference.
Yeah, I think that's a terribly fair characterization, and I have sort of three sort of reactions to it. One is something that is sort of maybe making a resurgence, but I don't see it everywhere, which is this idea that say what you will about the U.S. political system, about the Constitution, about our history, whatever it is, this is still the best decision-making framework that any country has ever adopted. And yes, there's problems like it's slow, but it is still the best thing. And something that's additionally beautiful is that all of us get to be a part of it. And that's simply
Right.
not true in a lot of other places. So there's this piece where we sort of undervalue it. I also think I'm optimistic because I know we have so much room to grow. Like if we think about just some very marginal improvements about people understanding a little bit more, you can see really big differences in what happens in local politics. A lot of those elections are determined with fewer than 15% of people coming out to vote. And so if you
Right.
just get a little bit more there, you
Right.
get a big change because the denominator denominator's not that big. But then on your point about like, what is the point? I'm just one cog in this big system. I can't change anything. That is such an inhibiting viewpoint. The idea that like you're too little, doesn't matter what you do, because you do not know whose civic role model you're going to be. It might be your child, it might be your nephew, it might be a kid who sees you waiting to vote, it might be someone who you talk to. And the idea that we're all just going to be nihilistically throwing it in because, what's the point anyway? That's not a way to live. There's no society that is feeling best when it's like, can't make any decisions here. It doesn't matter. We do better
Right.
with agency, and we have agency here. We've just sort of let ourselves be lulled into this idea that it's like uncool to do it or problematic or a pain, when really it's an honor and it's kind of a blessing in the sense that we
Yeah.
happen to be here and able to exercise this.
Yeah. No, that's great. And I'm glad you said what you said about our democracy, because I agree with what you said. And also, one of the reasons I do this work is I feel like I had a guest on, and I use this quote almost every podcast. So people are probably plugging their ears right now. But he said, if you only read the news, you'll think that things have never been worse. But if you read history, you'll realize things have never been better. And when people say, we've never been this divided before, it was really, we've never this, we've never that. This is the worst that's the worst that. And I agree with you that history is not well taught when it's what date did this happen or what. But I do think it's helpful, especially in this context, to think about what has this country survived in the past? What kind of debates have we had about the electoral colleges? What kind of controversial outcomes did we have in elections where it went to the House of Representatives, or when the Bush v. Gore decision was made and it's like, nope, this is the winner. We've been through some pretty gnarly, difficult stuff, and here we are. And I think understanding that can give people a sense of hope and optimism that we can get through whatever, whether it was the last presidency or this one, we get through it. Is that something that resonates with you?
That certainly resonates. And I come at it from a frame that's going to be different than yours, which is just like a 38-year-old woman. When I think about the life that I could live versus the life that my mother and her mother could live, like
Right.
at not all points could everyone get a credit card. At not all points could every woman serve on a jury. I moved to New York State married in 2010 when we didn't have no fault divorce. Like policy changes in a way
Yeah.
that benefits women that I can see in the short arc of my life. And so I
Right.
know that there's things to be hopeful about. And even if you point to like, yes, there's still wage discrimination that exists and there's still problems with equality, it is much better than it was 100 years ago. And I have reason to believe that if people keep pushing in positive ways, it gets better for the people who push hardest.
Exactly. And the pushing is the important part, because another pushback I get when I talk to anyone about optimism is there's a sense that optimists think that you're just going to sit around and things inevitably get better. And my point is, no, you think tomorrow's going to be better than today, but you know that you have a role in making it so. And so back to your point, all those things you just listed about the rights of women, those didn't just happen. People voted, they marched, they raised hell. I mean, good trouble, as John Lewis would say. And that to me is a really important thing to describe in the type of work that you're doing. That, yeah, you don't like this? Okay. Get a petition going, get out and vote, put a sign in your yard, whatever it is. That action is what's important. And you're a lot younger than I am. When people talk about the country being so divided, often I'll give the Civil War as an example. But how about the late 60s and early 70s? The Vietnam War was tearing this country apart. Watergate was tearing this country apart. And when people think the protests on campuses were disturbing, over Gaza and Palestine, look at the Vietnam protests. My God, I mean, there's no comparison. I was very little, but that was in my lifetime. And so I think it's really important to have that context.
Yeah, and I think something that becomes sort of hard to ever do context, and this is sort of just a quibble with our modern life, is you're never going to get the same slice of news, entertainment, whatever that I'm going to get. And the likelihood that there's overlap is just less and less because we have such a bifurcated, bespoke system where everyone's seeing their own things. And so it's really hard for people to make these sort of grand evaluative claims because we are not having like a grand evaluative experience that's the same. We're having a bunch of different ones where that wasn't true in the 70s, or it's less true in the 70s because there's simply fewer inputs to everyone's individual media consumption.
Yeah, fewer inputs and this sort of filter bubble where if I'm on this side of the political spectrum and pick an issue, and then I get online and I'm just being fed stuff that just feeds that view already. That raised a question for me. So you're teaching what, roughly 18 to 22-year-olds in a college setting. What are your thoughts on the pros and cons of today's media, social media, when it comes to these issues? We talk a lot about social media. Well, I guess we do about politics quite a bit. What are your thoughts about that? And for example, smartphones in high school classrooms and some of these things that have become more contentious. Do you have a point of view on these?
I have an enormous point of view on this. 2 years ago, I stopped wearing headphones anywhere in public, and I'm convinced that like ubiquity of AirPods is one of the markers of the downfall of a society, because you've already said like, I'm not giving you this sense, which means I'm probably not going to look at you, which means I'm not going to
Amen.
acknowledge your humanity. So this is a problem. I also think there's no way that our brains are optimized to have someone yammering in our ears all the time. And I understand I'm talking to someone in the podcast world. So like, yes, people have to do it, but it's too much. Like there's no way our brains are good with that much, oh, I don't have the stimulus of where I am. But when I think about the bigger question about social media, I actually abstracted a little bit more. When I think about what I'm mad at my parents for, it's like maybe for feeding me junk food and letting me have soda all the time and then being like, oh, we didn't know sugar was that bad. And what they're mad at their parents for is like smoking with them in their car without seatbelts and whatever. But the body is resilient, the lungs are resilient, it wants to stay alive. The thing that parents are doing today with their kids, which is like dumping them in front of a little dopamine slide to nowhere repeatedly that allows them to disassociate and think that that's how we live life, or that's like the best version of life. That's probably the most problematic thing we have done to children. And we sort of have this like moral panic about like, oh, it's the kids on their phone. And I'm like, I don't know. Have you seen 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80-year-olds on their phones? I actually don't think the kids did this to themselves. The technology is seductive, and we didn't gatekeep that well, in the same way that sugary cereal is seductive. And if you give kids the options, they're probably going to take it. And so, yeah, I have really strong thoughts on this. I have a daughter in a school that doesn't have a phone-free policy, and her friends all know me as like the phone witch, because I demand that when we hang out at my house, there's no phones. I
Yeah,
have a phone graveyard. And like,
love it.
but I have really good sleepovers. I'm like, I throw a good party, but you're not going to be able to have a phone at it. Sorry about that. Because I think it's really hard to get to know people if we're all taking in different inputs and not having the same sort of environment, because someone's collecting this memory so that they can post it later so that someone else can think about it. Yeah, problematic in my opinion.
I'm so glad I asked the question. And if you don't mind me asking, what's the age range? How old's your daughter?
I have a 12-year-old. So she's like
Yeah.
just
So
entered an upper school. Phones are now
yeah,
sort of like nearly everyone has it in her grade. And there's not really the political will within the school to take them out, because like the teachers are pushing back a little bit. But even my daughter herself sort of sees this for what it is. She was like, we can do our homework on our phones. All of our systems, like all of our homework is assigned online. If they want us to get off screens, why did they do it this way? I'm like, oh, fair point.
Lindsey Cormack encourages us to consider that despite our many challenges, in the U.S., we still have arguably the greatest system of government ever developed. But a strong democracy is like a muscle that needs to be exercised, and we shouldn't accept remarkably low turnouts in our elections, particularly on the local level. And we don't have to accept or expect kids to be on smartphones every hour of the day, and my hat's off to Lindsey for owning her characterization as the phone witch. She offers a lot of great advice about how we can raise kids who are more phone-free and spend less time on what she describes as a dopamine slide to nowhere. And now, to our final segment. I think one of the things that Jonathan Haidt in his book recommends to get phones out of school is not starting with the administration, not starting with the teachers, but starting with fellow parents who could sort of talk, hold hands, figure this out, and then go to this. Because one of the first reactions of a school is, well, the parents are going to freak out. Parents want to reach their kids if something awful happens at school. And I get that. Haidt would say, well, they don't need a smartphone for that. They can use a cell phone. Or like the old days, you could call the front office like we used to, but whatever. In some ways, that's a form of politics, I suppose. There's sort of grassroots organizing. If you say, okay, fine, I think there's enough parents here. If we could just all talk and realize and tell each other we got your back and then go to the school. Is that something that makes sense to you and maybe you've thought of or your friends have?
Yeah, I mean, that does make sense to me. I think everyone gets to this dystopian thought, which is like, well, if there's a school shooter, I want my kid to be able to say, I love you before the end, because it's not the case that your kid's going to call you and you're going to be the person who like stops that. That's just
Yeah,
like
right,
not real.
right, right.
But in terms of talking to other parents about it, what I am finding just experientially is like I'm just leading on it. And whenever I send an email to invite, I say like, hey, let your kids know when they're here, there's no phones. And I usually get back a bunch of like, oh my God, you're the best. Thank you. I could never do that. Like it's very easy. It's like my little kingdom. And I get to say no phones here. And I do it
Yeah,
in my classroom too. Like I tell my students, I'm like, guess what? For the next 75 minutes, there's no phones, there's no tablets, there's no computers. And for like 3 weeks, they have withdrawal where they're like, like, I don't know what's happening in the world. What are my friends doing? And then they realize at the end, it's like one of the best pedagogical decisions that's ever been thrusted upon them because they have to fully commit their brain to something and they're just not used to it. I was like, look, you have the rest of your life, every meeting you're ever going to take for the rest of your life to multitask and see what Jeff Bezos is selling and see what's going to happen. And like, it doesn't matter.
yeah,
But right
right.
now, for these last 75 minutes, perhaps of your life, we're going to have a conversation with 18 other people and we're all going to pay attention. And it is hard. It is hard because they're not trained for it. It's challenging.
No, and good for you because I did an academic fellowship about 3 years ago and audited classes, undergraduates and master's students who are much younger than I am. And as an auditor, I would generally sit in the back of the class, and often they were sort of sloped down. And so, the kids have their laptops open, quote unquote, taking notes. Well, from where I was sitting, I could see they weren't taking notes for the most part.
That's right.
And I think that there's a bit of a con going on. And I'm thinking, gosh, how much did they spend for this education? And they're
Correct.
making an open table reservation for dinner or whatever, shopping. So good for you for doing that. And then also just, well, you can take, if you really want to take notes, there is pen and paper and sort of the old fashioned way. And I think, again, you also, I think with your daughter, I was raised by pretty tough parents. Obviously, smartphones were not an issue, but curfews were and things like that. And having tough parents almost got you off the hook. It's sort of like, well, my dad, I got to get out of here, or right? So it's like your daughter's saying, well, my mom, she's the phone witch. It actually can give them a little bit of cover when they say, I'm not going to use my phone right now. Does that make sense to you?
And it absolutely does. I hosted an after party after one of their Halloween things. And my daughter sent me a text that she sent to her friends, which was like, here's the rules. We're going to leave school at this time. We're going to walk to my house. My mom is going to make you put your phones away. That's her thing, not mine. But here's what it
Yeah,
is.
right.
And I was so proud of her. I was like, thank you for setting their expectations correctly. Like you did a little mediating. And then when they come
Yeah.
in, I say, it has a tombstone. It's a phone graveyard. It's easy to understand. It says like,
Right.
yeah,
Do you really?
oh yeah. Oh yeah.
That's great. Yeah, and I'll charge it for you if you want, but it's staying right here.
Yeah, that's true. It sits in a little, it's in a cubby that does have 4 chargers. Yeah. And then I've also done stuff for sleepovers that I think can be fun, like where the first activity of the sleepover is we make a little bed and a little pillow for your phone. We make like a sleeping bag for your phone. And like some girls have made like Taylor Swift sleeping bags, and I'll have like pom-poms or
Love
foam
that.
stickers or whatever. And then we put our phones to bed and then we hang out.
Amazing. So if parents are listening to this and thinking, okay, let's forget the phone stuff for now, but the politics, the government, and they say, I want to do this. So obviously they should read your book, which I would recommend. And I really did enjoy reading your book. I think it's very well done and makes the point very well. What else can they do, though? Because I imagine some parents, like you said, weren't raised with much education. They themselves might be a little ignorant about this stuff. Let's be honest. What's the best way for them to feel empowered, to feel like they can handle this? Where can they get the information, the guidelines, that sort of thing?
Well, thank you for saying that about the book. I like this book too. It's my
Yeah,
second
that's
one, and I
good.
like it a lot better
Yeah.
than my first one.
There you go.
Yeah, and I think like even the intro, when I read like the 11 pages of like just the introduction, I'm like, yes, okay, this is an argument. But
Yeah.
here's the thing, there's a million things to learn, and we're never going to learn them all. And so I don't think it's like make sure you get this piece under your belt. I think it's have an open mind to learning a little bit in every instance that you're in. So instead of reading something on the news or hearing something on the news and being bewildered by it, go figure out one little piece. So, for instance, at the beginning of this new administration, there's a flurry of executive orders. And a lot of people are like, I don't even know what an executive order is. And
Yeah.
then the thought stops. It's like, what is that?
Yeah.
I don't know. And so it's just go learn a little bit more And it's not necessarily make sure you have your arguments refined, make sure you know what side of it you're on. It's be willing to have a little bit more of an input. And that takes seeking, which is not an activity that a lot of us are used to. We are used to passive consumption. It's like whatever the algorithm has delivered me next, whatever Google News has, here's the
Yep.
Substacks that I'm whatever.
Yep.
It's breaking that and instead saying, I am responsible for a little bit of my own learning here. I see there's a gap in the idea that people are talking about something I don't know. I can go figure it out. And truly, every American adult can figure out a few more things. It's not that
Yeah.
hard. It's
No.
maybe not what you want to do, but if you want to have a better grasp on things, be more mentally healthy, be more rooted in sort of your own understandings, it doesn't hurt. It's actually a really good activity, and you're modeling behavior for your kids that they might not see elsewhere. So make sure that they can kind of see that journey and do a little bit with you.
Yeah, and I think that's great. And that last part too, I think sometimes parents feel like they have to have all the answers or they look weak or whatever. And it's okay to say to a kid, actually, that's a really good question. Why do presidents have the pardon ability?
Hmm.
Like, what was the motivation for that? Or,
Hmm.
and again, these kind of tumultuous times, and again, I would argue they're not a whole lot more tumultuous than some in the past, but they provide these opportunities. So, one of the executive orders was about birthright citizenship. And it's like, well, what is that? How does that work? Wait a second. It's an amendment to the Constitution. So can the president do that? And if he can't, who can tell him he can't? And that's we're getting daily opportunities to study this stuff in a way that could be really interesting and helpful.
Yes, that's absolutely the case. So last week in class, we were doing the birthright citizenship
Oh, really?
executive order. Yeah, and I had a
There you
student.
go.
And then we looked, it says, are there any other Supreme Court cases that have sort of asked this question? Sure enough,
Right.
in 1898 there is. And it's just something where it's like, we are not going to have every piece of this information in our head. I'm not going to. Anyone who's doing politics in any big way is going to know a lot about a lot of things, but not everything about everything. And so you can always go learn a little bit more. And when you have these opportunities, such as like new policy formations, that's like the good time to do it. Go figure it out. And then next time you get into that same sort of issue space, you'll have a little bit more under your belt.
Fantastic. Well, Lindsey, this has been a real pleasure. I love the subject. I loved your book, How to Raise a Citizen and Why It's Up to You to Do It. I encourage everyone to check it out. And I'm really glad if my kids were taking your class, it would make me feel good because I just think this is really important. You bring a practicality and a passion for it that I think is extremely helpful. So I appreciate your time for this today, and thanks for everything you're doing.
And thank you so much for the work you're doing and for having me on here. This was really nice.
I appreciate it. Thanks. I know I can sound like an old crank when I talk about smartphones, but I'm increasingly convinced, not just from my own experience and observation, but also from people who study these things for a living, that for all the good these devices offer, there's a lot of negative repercussions that come from their overuse and misuse. Phone graveyards at home sound like a good place to start to me. And as we look for silver linings in what today feels like a chaotic time in national politics, Lindsey describes how she uses today's goings-on as a chance to dig in and really understand what is happening, what's allowed in our system, and what isn't. And she also looks to my old pal history to understand when we've experienced similar problems in the past, like birthright citizenship. I was not familiar with the 1898 case that Lindsey cited, so I looked it up. It's the U.S. versus Wong Kim Ark, and it's a pretty fascinating case if you'd like to check it out online. I hope you enjoyed this blue sky conversation with Lindsey Cormack. Before you go, we'd appreciate you leaving us a rating or review, and hope you'll consider subscribing to our podcast to be sure you don't miss any future episodes. My special thanks go to Crush Graphics, responsible for all graphic design and cover art for Blue Sky and the Optimism Institute. And that's Crush Graphics with a K if you'd like to check out more of their great work at crushgraphics.com. And each and every Blue Sky episode is made possible by the incredible editing and mixing done by the remarkable team at Sound On, Sound Off. You can learn more about them at soundonsoundoff.com. Until next time, I'm the founder of the Optimism Institute and host of Blue Sky, Bill Burke, and I thank you for listening.